Thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Olivia Carville. I'm on the board of the New York Financial Writers Association. We are the oldest financial journalism association in the US, and we regularly hand out scholarships to aspiring student journalists and hold events with our members where we welcome people from the journalism community to come on and talk to us about various topics. And one of the events that I run is the monthly reporting club, where we get a journalist to join us to talk about a particularly ambitious piece of work that they've recently published. And tonight I'm really excited that we have Josh Kaplan joining. He's a senior fellow with ProPublica, now covering extremism, which is a really interesting beat. But we have him on today to talk about a pretty fascinating story on how flawed the Washington, D.C. eviction system is. Josh is based in Brooklyn, and at the time that he wrote this piece, he was a freelancer. So welcome, Josh, and thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So to kick off, I'd love it if you would be able to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into journalism and how you got to ProPublica.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually didn't study journalism school. I studied mathematics and wrote one just kind of as a senior in college, wrote an investigation for an alt weekly in Chicago that I really enjoyed doing. But after I graduated, I kind of kept with my background and spent some time doing software engineering for various kind of public interest nonprofit groups. And a couple of years ago, I was starting to realize that I really wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to, see what if I could do that. And so I left my job, started freelancing, wrote some stuff in DC, was writing a column for Washington City paper for a little while, and then joined ProPublica at the beginning of last year as a fellow, which is still going on.
That's such a fascinating trajectory into journalism. It's such a different route than so many of us take. Speaking to your own colleagues, do you find that at ProPublica they have interesting backgrounds like yourself, or that most of them have come into ProPublica and the beat through a relatively regular process?
I mean, I think there's a huge amount of variation. I mean, some people always knew they were going to be journalists and have been pursuing it doggedly since they were 18. One colleague of mine used to be a preacher for a long time, and then took a path similar to me of left and started freelancing with alt weeklies, and then so it's a lot of fascinating people.
And when you decided to do that career shift, did you know that you wanted to do investigative work, or what was it about journalism that inspired you or made you want to make that kind of risky move?
I really wanted to be doing investigative work kind of from the beginning, which was one of the advantages of having done these other things first. Was I had a very clear idea of exactly what sort of reporting I wanted to pursue. But I don't know. I mean, I always loved writing, loved talking to people, and was a kind of journalism nerd as a reader. And so, I enjoyed the impact you could get doing technology, using technology in a kind of institutional context, but the chance of doing, I thought I would be doing more data journalism when I started, but to do that and expose things seemed way more exciting.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about this story that we are really eager to hear about. The title was "Thousands of DC Renters Are Evicted Every Year. Do They All Know to Show Up to Court?" Can you, as the author of this piece, just summarize it in a couple of sentences? What is the story about?
Yes. So this is a story about this little discussed aspect of the eviction system in DC, which is how tenants are told that they how tenants are told that they need to come to court. Uh, and this is important because tens of thousands of tenants have lost their eviction cases automatically because they miss these hearings. And so it's about two men who have come to dominate the industry, private process servers, dominate the industry of notifying tenants, and a whole lot of evidence of them regularly filing false sworn statements to the court.
And when you say dominate the industry, you mean the Washington, D.C. eviction
Right.
system, or do you mean the country?
The DC in particular, they are, by far, they're just at the core of the DC's eviction system. They also operate in Maryland and Virginia, though. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
regional flavor. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the most interesting things about the piece is just how unique it is and how nuanced it is to focus on that one particular document in what is a pretty lengthy process to evict a tenant.
Mm.
And I'd I'd really like you to just talk about the idea generation. How did you decide to focus on this particular document and this particular step in the process?
Absolutely. So I kind of got the idea. I'd heard that tenants tend to go through the eviction process without a lawyer. And I was just kind of curious and understanding the implications of that. And so I started going to eviction court. And kind of immediately the most striking thing to me was the fact that a huge amount of the tenants weren't there. And it's like, it's not at all uncommon for a judge to, call out 20 cases in a row. None of the tenants are, all 20 tenants aren't there. And then in like a matter of literally seconds, 20 people just lost their eviction cases. Um, and so I started, my first step was just to, call some tenants attorneys and be like, why is this happening? And obviously there are multiple reasons that that someone could not show up. Maybe they can't find childcare, they can't get off work. But I mean, one thing that I was kind of hearing again and again with tenants attorneys is they're saying, a lot of the tenants who end up coming to us at this moment of crisis when they've already like lost their case swear that they were never told, they had no idea they were being evicted, they had no idea this hearing was happening. And this one hearing is actually very consequential. It kind of, whether or not you're there, trans you know completely transforms your prospects of fighting your eviction. um, and then one attorney mentioned to me that they once happened to have two cases at once, where the person who was ostensibly telling the tenant that they needed to come to court claimed to be in two places in different parts of DC at the same time. And he was like, well, and so obviously we were able to get those two cases thrown out immediately because they had to be false, but we can't ever find them unless they fall into our lap. And that's like, it's only happened once that we actually had proof. Um, and so I started trying to figure out if I could prove it.
That's a pretty cool tip.
It was like definitely the dream. It was like a lawyer being like, there's this thing I've always wanted to do, but I've never been able to do.
So when you just casually started to attend eviction court in your spare time, were you working as a freelancer, or were you like, was someone employing you? Had you talked to an editor about this idea, or were you just kind of winging it?
I was just kind of winging it. When I first started going, I turned out like one or two dailies, just kind of about how eviction court's changing and what it's like. But that was more a pretext for me trying to find a bigger investigation to get into with it. And I mean, it was actually a while before I kind of, once I was pretty sure that there was like a good story here and not just like a lead. There was a while before I kind of officially got connected with an editor and an outlet that was like wanted to go spend a while looking into this.
And how did you go about pitching it to an editor and an outlet? Like, how did you choose an outlet? How did you write your pitch? And how much information did you put in there?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, for me, I mean, I knew this was going to take, if I was going to like actually show what, what was happening, it was going to take a lot of time, just doing the data work, if nothing else. Um, and so, was looking for somewhere that would have a budget to, like where I could possibly afford to spend months on something. Tried a few like large outlets, and didn't get responses. I hadn't worked with them before, and then the Spotlight DC, which is now a nonprofit investigative kind of organization in DC, happened to spring up like at right that time. This was, I think, either their first or second pitch that they accepted, and the executive director reached out to me. He'd read some of my other work and said, do you have any other ideas? And fortuitously, I had this idea at the time, and so there was a whole proposal process, which was like in great detail, like the 2,500 word proposal sort of thing, that had to go through their board, and which is all these like kind of accomplished investigative journalists in the DC area. And then, I think it was probably a couple of months between like conception of the idea until I was like officially knew that I was going to have somewhere to publish it.
Great. So you come up with this great idea through this tip by attending eviction court, and then you find an outlet that is, well, the Spotlight DC, that is willing to kind of help fund you to do this work. And what do you do then? Like, what's the first step? And you know that there's something fishy going on, and you want to look into it, but how do you go about doing that? Where did you begin?
Yeah, I mean, so my first step, right after, I mean, frankly, like right after I had this conversation with this lawyer, was to start building a database, to just try to take these court documents and turn it into, a format that actually made sense, and start writing code to, find possible contradictions in it. And so once I, had spent probably a few days working on the database, it was like very clear that Stevens and Buck were like the top dogs, in this industry, that they never ever found tenants, and that they filed documents that seemingly had to be false. And then also while I was doing that, I was just spending more time in eviction court watching. I learned about this like special room where they have hearings on more complicated motions, and was spending a lot of time hanging out there because I wanted to understand, like, obviously, I mean, the most obvious question is like, how does this actually affect tenants? And like the way I started trying to like realizing that it really affected tenants was, about probably once or twice a day, a tenant would show up with this motion to try to overturn a default they got because they missed their initial hearing. And sometimes they succeed, often they don't. It's like really, really hard to, you can get a default overturned, but the cards are stacked against you. And I was talking to tenants and learning about how horrible this process was for them.
Mm-hmm. Stevens and Buck are a big feature in this piece. They're kind of like lead characters in their own right, even though they never commented. They are the private process servers at the center of the story. I wonder, for those on the call who may not know what a process server is or what they do, could you just give some background as to who Stevens and Buck are, and where they worked and what they did?
Absolutely. So a process server is, if you watch TV and you see someone come up and say, "You've got served," like that's basically what a process server is they deliver an official court document letting you know you need to appear in court for something. And in the context of landlord-tenant court, what this means is they're telling you that you're facing eviction. This is why you're facing eviction, and you need to show up to court on this day, because that's basically like that is going to be the pivotal point in your case. And they're hired by either landlords or landlords' lawyers. So they're working for one party in the case. And Stevens and Buck are two private process servers who work out of one of their homes in Maryland. So it's this very small shop, but is also in the data I had, was about 60% of the kind of this like uh, fairly profitable industry in the district.
Mm-hmm. So you knew pretty early on that you wanted to focus on these two individuals in particular. How did that change your reporting process and what you were trying to find or potential sources to talk to?
Yeah, I mean, and there were other process servers I was tracking for a while who also had similar problems. I eventually decided, like, it was as it when it became clearer and clearer I should focus on these guys because they were the big dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I mean, it meant that I one thing I really wanted to do was not just present this data uh, that shows that they're doing, filing documents that can't possibly be true, because that felt, in some ways kind of dry, or at least like when I was writing it, I could imagine it, coming off as academic, and I wanted to figure out, where are these people when they are claiming that they're out serving tenants, and so I spent a while trying to do that, which ended up in like I thought about following them, and was cautioned by a very good editor that that could backfire. And so I got the idea that maybe they'll have to show up in court for something, either because they're part of a case or because they're personally getting sued or something like that. And so I started kind of monitoring the dockets in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and eventually saw that Carl Stevens had this DUI in Maryland coming up, and so I went to follow him out there when his hearing came, and just kind of sat in the room with him, and pretended to be reading a book, and was like writing down where he was at what time, because there were no phones allowed. And then waited a couple weeks, and he waited a couple weeks, and then checked all the where he was, all the documents he filed that day, and was able to show that he was in the room with me when he claimed he was 20 miles away in DC. And then, like, in other ways, it was, so there was a lot of like, that's kind of like, there was a lot of just like trying to find as many different ways of proving what they're doing, but also trying to connect with tenants who've been trying to fight back. Because one thing that I wanted to do was to not just make this a story, entirely about them, but about like the system that allows them to continue. And so, spent a lot of time, meeting tenants in, a million different ways, and talking to lawyers, and, reading, thousands of pages of court transcripts to try to figure out, one, with these law firms that hire them, how much evidence have they seen over the years and ignored? So that was a kind of big question for me. And then also, when there's any evidence that does kind of somehow make it into the courtroom, how do the judges treat it? What does the system do when there's some kind of indication that something is not right with this process that's supposed to go very smoothly?
Mm-hmm. I feel like as journalists, often, well, traditionally, we're used to the, finding sources and interviewing people and recording interviews and writing kind of narrative stories and writing with flair or for readers to kind of stay with us. But what a lot of us aren't as familiar with is the data side. And certainly I'm a reporter at Bloomberg, and I'll work on the narrative or the story side, and then I'll work with our data team to help me with the heavy lift on the data end. But it sounds like you did both here. And earlier you mentioned that you were writing your own code to build this database. So would you say that this story really was born out of the data and then you found the individuals rather than the other way around?
Absolutely. I was starting to do kind of traditional reporting, but it really started with the data. It was I, which was actually the easiest part of it. It was, it took some time to eventually build this database, but once it was there, it was just hiding in plain sight.
Mm-hmm. And when you read through this story, it is just so compelling. All of the different data points that you have are fascinating in their own right. And I feel like it's very rare to have a story and to have a data analysis where you're kind of spoilt for choice when it comes to what numbers you want to highlight, or what things you want to bullet point through the piece. And here it just looked like you had so much. So how did you go about looking at the data and analyzing like where these individuals were at the time, and the impossible movements that they claimed that they were making in these affidavits? And how did you decide what to highlight and what not to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of these contradictions, that was, I mean, so basically like how the database worked, if just to kind of explain it really quickly, is when I was starting, at least, I started with the first case of the year because I was starting it kind of near the beginning of the year, and then read this, put that into my database, read the second case, read the third case, read the fourth case, and then eventually, it was like about 6,000 cases. And that was enough to kind of have like about 12,000 instances of where these men are claiming to be at what time. And then I wrote code to kind of turn that into a timeline that could detect when they had were either claiming to be in two different places at once, or moving kind of impossibly quickly, like traveling miles and miles in a couple of minutes. And so I mean that kind of produced like this like wealth of examples as I went, and it was just then reviewing all those, the like kind of the code flagged manually, and keeping notes on them. And so I mean, in terms of that, I mean I had my kind of, as I was investigating this, my favorite examples of the ones that were I mean basically like having equivalent to driving between DC and Philadelphia in 15 minutes. Like they're just like, there are lots and lots of examples, but there's some that are particularly insane. I mean, more broadly, like, I mean, yeah, there was a lot left on the cutting room floor though, in terms of, uh, both, I mean, less probably about these two than in terms of the law firms they work with.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like a lot of conversations with my editor about, what do we need to prosecute, not literally, make this feel unimpeachable without getting boring.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned the word insane, and I have to just reiterate what you said earlier, that the most insane example would have to be the DWI charge, and that you followed Stevens to the courtroom. You were there in the room with him, taking notes of the time, and then he later filed sworn affidavit saying that he was serving summons to these tenants when it's just he can't be in two places at once, right? And I just have to bring up this one line that I absolutely loved in the story. You wrote, in all, Stevens would later swear that he attempted to serve 16 tenants in the District of Columbia while this reporter was staring at the back of his head. It's very rare for you to be able to write a story like that, a line like that in a story. Can you talk a little bit about like putting yourself in the piece, and like, did that feel natural? Was that organic, or was that something you were encouraged to do?
Yeah, I mean, it was tricky actually. I mean, I had a lot of fun writing that section, but it was like it was a tonal different. Like, I mean, there was no way for me to write that without explaining that I was there. And ultimately decided to like just try to lean into that and make it feel like a caper a little bit. But it definitely took some work to try to meld me being in there with the fact that I have 3,000 words about civil procedure law. It wasn't immediately as seamless.
And can you put us in your shoes? You're in this courtroom, you're witnessing this DWI charge, and then later you go back through the records, weeks later you said, and you saw that he happened to claim he served a summons at the exact time you were in the courtroom with him. For you, what did it feel like to see that and to be able to say, well, okay, here we have a pretty clear example of the fact that this is false?
Oh, I was excited. Yeah. No, I mean, it was like, it had been a bit of a gambit and I had no idea if it was going to work, because it seemed rather bold for him to do that. So, I mean, I was thrilled when it paid off, and it was like, I I think I went through about 700 cases just surrounding, where he could possibly have been, on the day I was with him. And so it was a process to find these, but it was very, I was jumping up and down when I found them.
Yeah, definitely worth it. For those who are on the call with us, I just want to say feel free to send any questions that you have through the chat function in Zoom, and I'll be sure to ask Josh as we're going through. But I did want to just circle back to another thing you mentioned earlier, which was how you have all this data, you know what the story is going to say, but now you have to find a human face for the data to say, of these hundreds or thousands of people that were unable to be in court to represent or defend themselves in these eviction cases, behind every number or every statistic is an individual. And you decided to go in on a man called Jelatich in the intro. His name escapes me.
Joe.
Right. And so in this particular piece, you had such compelling evidence and data, an incredible story. And I wonder, how did you decide to go with like an anecdotal lead? Why did you decide that Joe Jelatich was the right man to start on?
Absolutely. I mean, and this was something like when I was first starting to draft, I was, went back and forth on and, trying to think it through. But ultimately, I mean, this felt like a really wonky story. Like it is, kind of obscure people involved in an obscure part of the law. And, even like the findings that, suggest kind of large scale fraud didn't really feel like they would pop unless readers had a sense of what the stakes were. And so, there were like, a few people I thought about, having be the lead. Because I met a lot of tenants over the course of this who were affected this in various ways. I mean, Joe, one, I should say he's a very, very lovely man and extraordinarily articulate and smart, and he had, so I mean that was certainly part of it. We talked, we'd spent hours and hours and hours talking. But I mean, it was but the main reasons I think were, one, his scenario of the effects he says he experienced because of this, conduct by the process servers. It was the absolute worst case scenario. He lost his home of over 20 years and became homeless for for like at least a year. And the other thing that I think was really made his story very valuable for tying the whole piece together was that he was treated really badly by the judges. Like, unlike some people who are evicted after they default, he found out a couple days. He says he found out a couple days before his eviction was scheduled, and tried to get some more time. And in the end, at this hearing where he was about to be evicted, hours later, the judge didn't let him speak and called security on him as he's in his mild-mannered way saying, excuse me, can I ask a question? And he's like, get security up here right away. I mean, it was just like this extremely cold moment that I think tied Carl Stevens to this whole broader system that supports him.
It was really reflective of like the crazy power dynamic between them as well. And I thought it was incredible in this piece where Carl Stevens, not only has he filed all of these false affidavits as your research found, but he actually testified in that case in court against Jelatich, saying that he served a summons on these 2 dates and stuck it on the door. And you could just really feel for Jelatich in that scenario, because as the reader, like, that he probably didn't, but that's a pretty brazen lie to get in front of a courtroom and say under oath, like, yes, I did.
Right. I mean, well, and it's like that's part of the job for these guys is if they if a tenant tries to challenge this, they have to go in and swear that they actually did what they said they did. But I mean, it's interesting that going in court and swearing in front of a judge that this is an accurate document is actually like not that different from the document itself. These are all sworn statements.
Right.
And I mean, that's part of the reasons why this has been this is so difficult for a tenant in this position, because one could imagine naturally how a judge would think that the person who does this for a living and is could face criminal penalties for lying is always is the more trustworthy one. And there's actually like a lot of case law that like kind of guarantees that process servers are presumed to be truthful, unless there's like significant evidence that suggests otherwise.
And playing devil's advocate, though, is it possible that in some of these cases where you say, Carl Stevens claimed he was in 2 different places at one time, or that he went to all these different locations within an hour, which is physically impossible, could he have sent out workers or representatives on his behalf who served the summons? Or is it possible that maybe he did go and knock on the door and just didn't take the time down right?
I mean, so just looking at the data, yes, it's absolutely conceivable that these are things that he could have done. It'd be against the law, because these documents are these documents are sworn statements, and you are swearing down to the detail. And there could be serious consequences, even for potentially serious consequences even for mistakes, if that was what it was. I mean, and that was, but like that, I mean, because that question was part of the reason where it felt so important to find something besides the data, find surveillance footage that showed that he didn't come at all when to a tenant who swore that she never got it. And trying to find as many ways of kind of triangulating the evidence.
And I thought another really interesting part of this story is that Stevens and Buck just refused to respond to your repeated phone calls, letters, emails. And can you talk a little bit about that? Like, when did you first reach out to them? How much detail did you provide to them about, what was going to be in the story? And when did you decide to give up?
Yeah, I mean, so I first reached out to them in November of 2019, actually, because I wanted to start the conversation. I felt like I had enough evidence that I didn't really need to worry about them covering their tracks. And so I, sent Carl Stevens an email and said, I have these 2 documents, so can you explain to me what's going on? He didn't respond. And I called him, and someone who I think is him picked up the phone, and he said, hey, hi, is this Carl? He hung up when I said I was a reporter. And so, I mean, that was kind of it for then. I had, made my contact, and I was at the same time doing the same thing with all the law firms that hire him. And then, when it came time for the story, it was actually, going to publish. I sent him and Matthew Buck, kind of probably like 8-page long letters or something, just with every single piece of information that was in the story. And I mean, honestly, I stopped trying to reach them when I heard from a source inside a landlord, in the landlord world, that they knew that they'd gotten it and had decided that they were not going to participate no matter what. And they were just hoping it would go away.
We've got a question here from one of my fellow board members, Peter Coy. He's asking if you worried in the early days that the story wouldn't pan out and that your editors might have said that you wasted your time.
Yes and no. I mean, I absolutely was worried that it wouldn't come to fruition. I mean, especially it was working with a nonprofit was challenging, and that like it was a bit of touch and go in terms of, I think we were both figuring out, like they were figuring out how they worked while I was trying to figure out how to pull off the story. I mean, that was one of the nice things about starting with the data, was I was sure that they were committing, like this was happening, and it was not hard to find tenants who had been affected by it. Um, but I mean, it certainly was a while before I was resting easy that the story had come into, was going to hit as hard as I wanted it to.
Right. And the story was quite delayed in getting published. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So
Um,
when did you finish it and when was it published?
um, it was finished in like, I mean, depends on how you like December 2019.
Okay.
Um, and then, you know, with some like institutional kinks getting worked out, and then COVID, and then the
Mhm.
anti-police brutality protests over the summer, it kind of got pushed down the road.
Right. Well, I think that's a really interesting kind of point here, that during the delay in publication of this piece, we had two global news events with the Black Lives Matter anti-police brutality protests and the fight for racial justice, and then a global pandemic. And I feel like both of these news events touch this story as well. So how did it, for you as the reporter who's kind of finished this huge, thesis of work, to then turn around and have to try and factor in those two totally separate news events about a pandemic affecting evictions, which kind of changed the process too, and then racial injustice, which is a big part here as well, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's certainly, I think, even for people who hadn't really thought about evictions as a problem, or as a kind of fundamental problem before the pandemic started, um, it became on a lot more people's minds. And so, that was one thing I uh, tried to connect it to the pandemic. That was one of the few reporting pieces I did in 2020, was figuring out how to make that hit home, because it is like, this is a bit of a ticking time bomb. This process gets, the process gets worse when the courts get more overwhelmed, and experts expect that the courts will be more overwhelmed than ever after the pandemic. I mean, logistically, obviously it was difficult. Everyone, I think anyone who's written this story, sitting on a story for 6 or more months is anxiety provoking, but um, I think ultimately it didn't hurt that much for the wait.
I feel like the Black Lives Matter protest would have, in a way, like helped this piece, because a lot of these people who are being evicted and who are being treated poorly in this process and in this system are likely people of color from low socioeconomic neighborhoods. How did that movement shape your reporting or the editing process towards the end?
Um, Frankly, I don't think it really did. Not because, you're absolutely right that they're intimately tied, but it was, I think, the racialized aspect of this was kind of always had to be a big part of the piece,
Mhm.
just because it's it's impossible to miss if you spend time in eviction court that
Mhm.
the landlords and lawyers are almost all white. The tenants, at least in DC, the tenants facing eviction are majority Black. In this case, the process servers are white, um, and it felt like it would have been wrong to overlook that part.
Mhm. You did have one tenant in there specifically say like how she felt as a Black tenant going before a judge arguing this, and that she felt like she would be deemed guilty before she even arrived in the courtroom. Do you feel, looking back, that that could have been a bigger part of the story?
Yeah. Um, I think there's a whole, so when this, there was a point in time where we were thinking that we would do several follow-ups.
Mm.
And I think, specifically honing in on the way race plays into these eviction processes, could have been its own story, its own second story. There are a couple other things that, once I started with this ungodly long draft, like then we lopped them off and could have become their own things. I mean, but she was an amazing, amazing woman. This the tenant you're referring to is Keisha Whitlock, and she, had been going through this eviction process for a long time, and as her landlord was kind of trying to empty out the building, um, and managed to like come up with all these brilliant ways of proving that they were not going through the process legally. Um,
We have another question from someone who's joining us on the panel. Bonnie Sincock is writing in saying, do you think that your story will result in permanent change? And if so, does that change have ramifications beyond DC?
yeah, so I mean, one of the immensely satisfying things about this story was that the day after it came out, they changed the law to
Pretty good.
yeah, it was good to kind of protect tenants from potential fraud. Requiring that process servers document what they do with photographic timestamp photos instead of the court doing what it's done for decades, which is taking them at their word. I would hope that there'll be more reforms. There's kind of the DC Council has said that they, a couple council members have said that they fully plan to introduce like a more robust package in this year, both around process service and also just some of the eviction mill like aspects of the system in general. So hopefully more is coming, and I mean I do absolutely think this is something that applies to many different jurisdictions in their own way. I mean, some jurisdictions have had serious problems exposed in the past by lawyers, like New York City had a lot of scandals exposed by the attorney general decades ago and fixed its system essentially. And then there are other cities that are reckoning with it right now. The Philadelphia Inquirer did some very good work on a kind of similar process, a similar problem in the eviction system in Philly.
I think one of the great things about the piece is that you don't just present like the investigation and your findings, you actually go into detail on potential solutions or possibilities for reform. Like you talk about how New York City has tackled the problem by requiring process servers track their whereabouts via GPS. Or another potential solution would be conducting periodical audits of process servers' affidavits to ensure that they're not being falsified. And to see that you got kind of traction so quickly after the story, that must have been really satisfying for you as a reporter.
Yeah, no, it best feeling in the world, absolutely. When something that you've become obsessed with over a long period of time changes. Yeah, I mean, we felt it was important to kind of include that sort of possible reforms. I mean, one because it could lead to the outcome it led to, which was kind of give an easy blueprint for change, but also just because it felt important to document that the change, like fixing this was easy, but it hadn't been fixed for decades. Even as I started to dig into the history of this problem, people have been raising alarms about this kind of exact same problem with different process servers. Cut Mad Libs with the names since the 1970s.
Have there been any specific consequences for Stevens and Buck that have come out of this? And have you heard from them at all since you published?
I haven't heard from them. I know, one law firm stopped working with them, kind of the probably fanciest big landlord law firm in DC. I don't know about the others. I haven't heard from them yet. And I'm not going to talk that's all I'm going to say about consequences for now.
Okay. You mentioned in the piece that a lawsuit was filed against Stevens in February. Did any of your reporting, did your reporting have anything to do with that lawsuit?
Yes. I had talked to the lawyer, a while before he filed it, and he, I don't want to claim that I gave him the idea of this. I he's very interested in this topic as well. But you know, it's funny actually. Some of the reporting that hadn't come out yet is cited in the lawsuit, um, and I mean, but yeah, I mean, I'm trying to avoid being
Scooping
bombastic. Like,
yourself.
right. That was I definitely did that a little bit. But but yeah, no, I mean, it was definitely, if the story had come out a bit earlier, it would have kind of been a direct lie.
Yeah, because it would have been a direct consequence of the story coming out as well, I imagine.
Right. And yeah, and it was funny. I mean, that was one of the strange things about just how long, for a variety of perfectly good reasons it ended up taking, was like things started to change once I told all the tenants attorneys. By the time I was done with this, I knew just about every tenants attorney in town, and I told them all because I was excited and I wanted to be. And I was working very closely with them,
Mm-hmm.
and then 2020 rolled around and it didn't go out, and things started that had been waiting like 50 years, like just started to change,
Mm-hmm.
as this kind of word got around that this was coming. And then obviously there was a much larger law change once it was out.
Mm-hmm. And so at the end of your reporting process, when you've done all this data analysis, you've spoken to, I think, like dozens of people, you've attended, I don't even know how many eviction court hearings at this point, and, seen the Stevens inside the court during the DWI charge, and then seen him file sworn affidavits that he was actually elsewhere. How do you sit down and turn all of that reporting, all of that research, all of those databases into like a well-written narrative?
Yeah. I mean, it was a trickier, like, it was a tricky story to write in some ways, just because there's a lot of spinach basically that you have to feed the reader in terms of how this process works, how it should work, why it matters, these details of the law. Um, and so, I mean, kind of how I thought about it was, and I talked about this. I had a terrific editor that I was working with on this, Bill Hogan, but it was like a telescope. Like I wanted to start with Joe Jeletich and the consequences the kind of consequences he had to face for this, and then go down to Carl Stevens and Matthew Buck, introduce them, build up the evidence against them, so that at a certain point in the story, you're like, the reader is very confident in their falsehoods, and then from there start going into the broader system that allows that to continue. And that was kind of how I tried to organize the material.
And from your perspective as like obviously an expert on this particular area of the eviction process now, where do you think that the system's failing? Because you discussed earlier that it's not just the process servers who, obviously taking advantage of this like seeming loophole in the system by being able to game it. It's also the judges who are involved, the lawyers who hire them who are involved. Like there are a lot of parties who must know about what's going on and haven't really done a lot to stop it. So what, from your perspective, like where is the system failing?
Yeah, I mean, there are failures that are very specific to process service in terms of things that could be fixed. I mean, I think the more fundamental failing is, I mean, and this is true in eviction courts, not just in DC, but around the country. I mean, eviction court essentially functions as a debt collection process, more so than a criminal courtroom, or it is a mill. They try to move through as many cases they possibly can as quickly as they can because they're overwhelmed, and the tenants only show up there once, whereas the plaintiff's lawyers are there every day, and they kind of run the show. I mean, they get to set the schedules. They, in order to be efficient, they are dependent on the landlord's lawyers. The system is dependent on landlord's lawyers helping it work, like running it essentially. That leads to all sorts of problems, because if you are operating at that volume, it really, the way to make money as a landlord's lawyer is to uh, go through as many, have as many cases as you can end as quickly as they possibly can. And I'm not, and it would be unfair to imply that they knew everything that Carl Stevens was doing, but you have very little incentive to look into problems, because you know anything that makes the process move less quickly eats into your margins, and the only way to play that game is to have the margins low, which is a long-winded way of saying, I think, the deepest form that needs to happen with eviction court is to figure out a way to make it so these cases can take more time, which might mean guaranteeing that every tenant has a right to a lawyer, um, and might mean just putting more resources into it. Or something that's been proposed by some scholars is to not have courts handle this at all and make it an administrative process that could handle it more fairly.
Mm-hmm. Once the story came out, what was the feedback that you received from, tenants' rights lawyers, from the tenants that you yourself talk to, and just from kind of the public or the community?
It was good. I was worried no one was going to read it because it's a 7,000 word article about civil procedure. I mean, the tenants I was talking to were extremely happy, which was very important to me that they, uh, were glad to put their names out there. And the tenants advocate community in DC and in some other places were obviously excited because this is an issue they'd been really talking a lot about internally for years and years and years. And I mean, I was surprised to hear from some landlords lawyers reach out to me. Were like, "Thanks for doing, like we're glad you wrote this article. This is crazy. No one should be allowing this to happen." So it was exciting to see that it kind of got around, and the DC Council was quick to pick it up.
That's great. And just a reminder to people on the call that we've got about 5 minutes left with Josh tonight. So if you do have any questions, feel free to write them in and I'll be sure to ask. Another thing I really wanted to talk about before we run out of time is the multimedia aspect here. Like, this is a story that isn't just a great narrative with incredibly compelling data, but you also have photographs of the tenants. You also have documents embedded into the piece. You also have like a video function where you can watch a time slot of all the different places that Stevens like claimed that he was over a certain period. And when did you decide that you wanted to include multimedia aspects, and why did you decide that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was envisioning this kind of as I was reporting it, I always kind of envisioned that there would be these animations to somehow show, show what this looks like on a map, because it's like, even just starting to kind of, write memos to myself as I was reporting of how I might write a given section. It's one thing to see it written out on paper, but if you actually, like, how I was doing this was when I was checking my examples myself was by looking back and forth on Google Maps and like seeing the exact route they would have to go. And that's what really makes clear how ridiculous these claims are. And so, and I had a editor who was very game to try to incorporate that into the story and figure out how to actually make it work.
You mentioned earlier that you were a bit worried about the fact that parts of the story is like making your readers eat spinach. I think that was the term that you used. Do you feel like, looking back, that you did the best job you could to try and make it digestible?
I mean, I'm sure I didn't do the best job one could. I I tried a lot of different ways with that, because I think, I mean, ultimately it ends up front loaded, which has its drawbacks, and its and that I could certainly can imagine the people left at that point in the story, but that, I mean, that was a challenge. I tried to breeze through it, tried to incorporate it with kind of the history of DC
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, but at the end of the day, to actually understand what any of the evidence means, you kind of have to have seen this all already. And I'm sure there's a better solution that someone else could have thought of, but it was the kind of smoothest way of making it work of the things I tried.
Right. I ask because as a financial journalist organization, we often have to make our readers eat spinach because, we're writing about complex kind of business stories or economic stories. And do you have any advice for members who may be listening that do have to tackle some of these difficult topics that are really complex and have lots of different layers, the best way to try and make it digestible?
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one was, I spent a lot of time figuring out, uh, what was the absolute minimum someone had to know about this system to understand what I was going to show them, rather than understand the system itself. And like, there were certain things I had to, or felt obligated to explain, but other than that, it was just, what are the, very least amount I can tell you to understand why it matters, why these affidavits matter. And the other was, I think, trying to narrativize it as much as possible, which was difficult. I'm sure it didn't really come off as a narrative, but at least, as this kind of process was getting in place, DC was changing as a city, and DC was facing evictions as it was changing as a city. And I, to some extent, tried to tie those together. And I think kind of anytime you can obviously put rules in a timeline, like as a reader, at least, that always makes me, I don't know if I got it as a writer, but as a reader, I feel like that works extremely well.
The affidavit of service that you focused on is such a niche topic, or like part of this process. When you started researching this area, were you looking at past media coverage of this particular topic, or looking for like research reports who have written about this? Had this area been covered much before? I saw in the piece that you referenced a Washington Post article from the 1970s, but like surely in like the last 50 years, someone else has looked in this area.
When I started on this, couldn't find any coverage of it outside of the Post in the 70s, in the in the popular press. Academically, there are people who've studied this. Actually, one of the lawyers I talked to wrote her master's thesis on this particular problem, and so that was very invaluable for understanding the history and context of this and the aspects of the law. But I mostly learned the law. I was reading like textbooks and case law to like make sure I got it right. But I mostly learned it through a lot of very generous attorneys who spent a lot of time walking me through the process, helping me fact check how I explain the process, because there's a lot of very fine-tuned details that end up being very significant.
Mm-hmm. And as reporters, when we approach stories like this, or kind of any stories that we're pitched, we often have to like look at them through a pretty cynical eye. Like we get PR pitches all the time, and it's like, oh, I don't know if I necessarily believe that or agree with that, or I'll need to ask more questions about it. But we also, on the other hand, have to approach tips with a pretty cynical eye too. And so you received this incredible tip from a tenant's attorney who said that, there were sworn affidavits filed at exactly the same time in the same case, which meant that it was impossible for them to both be there at the same time. And then you start looking into it and you do all this data analysis. Did you also try and kind of disprove your hypothesis, to look at the data through as many different lenses as you possibly could, to say, is it possible that maybe, the narrative I'm building or the idea that I see in my mind is inaccurate, or it's, it's not objective, or it's not fair?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I, once I kind of had my stuff, and wasn't worried about keeping a secret anymore. I mean, I started talking to landlords, attorneys in DC, ones that there are some landlords and there's some lawyers in DC that have a really bad reputation in the tenant community. Some that have a good reputation. They serve their landlord's interests, but they do it by the books. And so I went to them and was like, here's what I'm finding about this guy that you don't work with, but some of the your colleagues do. And they were very disturbed by that. And I brought it to, landlords, lawyers in other cities who maybe wouldn't have a dog in the fight. And they helped me kind of understand it better. And I also brought it to, really the richest kind of source material, like history on this is through, federal prosecutions of process serving companies. And so I started taking it to prosecutors who'd, led these landmark cases, 20, 30 years ago. And they kind of helped me feel, much more solid that this was meant what I thought it meant.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, the last question I have for you tonight is, for your readers, what did you hope their takeaway was from this piece?
I mean, I think the biggest one is that, and one of the things that like really guided me throughout it was, the eviction system doesn't really give a whole lot of credibility to tenants who are fighting to keep their homes. And I wanted to raise this, make clear to the people this example where tenants were ultimately the far more credible ones, and where the system had never been able to figure that out, despite having years and years and years of chances to do so. So I would hope that people think about the eviction system in a different way, as well as thinking about these two particular process servers.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that's a really good place to stop. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight, Josh. That was a really interesting conversation, and it was an incredible piece of work. And we're really grateful for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was really fun.
Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and thanks for arranging Brett.